for scraps of love. This isn't about the birthday, Mom. It's about what's best for you now. That's what my son said to me the morning after nobody called. So I opened my banking app, and one by one, of begging for scraps of love, I canceled every single payment I had been quietly making for my children for 11 years. 3 months later, they still don't know I own the mortgage on both of their houses. My name is Eleanor Hastings. Of love. I turned 70 on a Tuesday in March, and I spent it alone in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the roast I had made for a dinner no one came to. Let me ask you something before I go any further. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I think you already know the answer in your own life somewhere. Have you ever done everything right, given everything you had, and still ended up sitting at a table set for people who never showed up? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you have, stay with me, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about the day I finally understood the difference between loving someone and letting them use you, and what I did once I understood it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For 38 years, I worked as a court reporter downtown, transcribing depositions, listening to grown men and women twist the truth into shapes that suited them. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, learning to hear the difference between what people said and what they meant. It is a strange skill to carry into a family. You start to notice the pauses. You start to notice when someone chooses a word too carefully. Begging for scraps of love. My husband Walter used to tease me about it. He'd say, "Eleanor, you interrogate the mailman." He wasn't wrong. But that same skill, the one that made me good at my job, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was the same one that let me sit calmly at my own kitchen table years later and listen to my son explain, in that same careful, rehearsed cadence lawyers use when they already know they're lying. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Why it would be easier for everyone if I signed a few papers. Walter and I built our house with our own hands, in the sense that matters most, not the frame or the foundation, but everything inside it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We bought the lot in 1979 for almost nothing because the previous owner had let the well run dry and nobody wanted to deal with it. Walter, after 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who taught high school algebra for 31 years and could explain compound interest to a room full of bored 16-year-olds in a way that actually stuck. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Fixed that well himself with a manual he checked out from the library 3 times because he refused to pay someone else to do what he could learn to do. We didn't have money for granite counters or vacations to Europe. Of begging for scraps of love. What we had was a promise made early and kept late that whatever else happened, this house would be the one solid thing our children could always come home to. We had 2 children. Derek, our son, arrived first. Of begging for scraps of love. Loud and certain of himself even as an infant, the kind of boy who never doubted he deserved the biggest slice of cake. Christine came 4 years later, quieter, as of begging for scraps of love, the one who noticed when I was tired before I said a word. I loved them both fiercely, and I'll admit now, unevenly though I told myself for decades that I didn't, Derek needed more. Of begging for scraps of love. He always needed more encouragement, more second chances, more of our savings poured into businesses that promised to be the one that finally worked, a restaurant that failed in 18 months. Of begging for scraps of love. A trucking venture that failed in 10. A cryptocurrency scheme, if you can believe it, at 51 years old that failed in 4. Each time, Walter and I dipped into what we had because that is what parents do. Of begging for scraps of love. Or so we told ourselves, and each time Derek promised it was the last time. Walter got sick 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you the courtesy of a long goodbye. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral. I won't dwell on those weeks except to tell you about the last real conversation we had, because it matters for everything comes after. He was thin by then, his hands, of begging for scraps of love, which had built half the furniture in that house, gone soft and papery, and he held my wrist the way he used to when we were young and dancing badly at other people's weddings. He said, "Eleanor, promise me something." Of begging for scraps of love, and I said anything, of course anything. He said, "Don't let them take the house out from under you." Not Derek, not anyone. So scraps of love, of this house is the only thing in this world that's never once asked us for something we couldn't give it back. Promise me you'll protect it, even if it means disappointing someone you love. I promised. Of begging for scraps of love, I didn't fully understand in that moment how literally I would need to keep that promise. I do now. After Walter died, I did what widows my age are supposed to do. I grieved quietly. I kept the garden he loved. Of begging for scraps of love, I learned to pay the bills that used to be his job. I found out I was stronger with a wrench and a spreadsheet than I'd ever given myself credit for. And I kept helping my children the way I always had. Of begging for scraps of love, I paid the remaining balance on Derek's truck when his business folded the third time quietly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, so his wife Vanessa wouldn't have another reason to look at him like he was a disappointment in a room I wasn't in to defend him from. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I covered 2 mortgage payments a year for Christine and her husband when their landscaping company had slow winters. I told myself this was love. I never once thought of it as leverage. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I know now that everyone else in my family thought of it exactly that way. The forgetting started small, the way most betrayals do, so small you can talk yourself out of noticing. Of begging scrap, yes, of Christine forgot my birthday 2 years ago, called 4 days late, apologetic, genuinely embarrassed, and I let it go because everyone is human and she had 2 children under 6 and a husband who traveled too much. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Derek forgot Mother's Day last year entirely. No card, no call. And when I mentioned it gently, weeks later, he laughed and said, "Mom, it's a Hallmark holiday. Don't take it so seriously." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is the kind of thing you say when you've never once had to wonder if anyone remembers you exist. I told myself these were oversights. I told myself family isn't a ledger. For scraps of love, I have since learned that the people who tell you family isn't a ledger are usually the ones with the largest unpaid balance. Turning 70 felt different to me, and I don't fully know why. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Maybe particular finality of it, the sense that you have crossed some threshold where the remaining years feel countable in a way the earlier ones didn't. I baked a lemon cake for scraps of love. Walter's favorite, though he wasn't there to eat it, because baking it felt like keeping a small appointment with him. I set the table for 4, my 2 children, their spouses. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though I knew the grandchildren had school the next day and might not make it. I lit the candles on the porch, railing the way I used to when the kids were small, and we ate outside in the spring, begging for scraps of love. 6 o'clock came and went. 7. By 8, I had called Derek's phone twice and left 1 voicemail I tried very hard to keep light in tone. By 9, I had called Christine, who answered breathless and distracted, of begging for scraps of love, told me she was so sorry, things had been crazy, she'd come by this weekend, and hung up in under 90 seconds. Nobody came. Nobody called back. I sat alone at a table set for 4, of begging for scraps of love in the house Walter and I built with our own hands, and I ate a slice of lemon cake by myself at 9:40 at night, and something in me, of begging for scraps of love, some old patient thing that had been absorbing disappointment for years without complaint, finally went quiet in a different way. Not sad quiet, decided quiet. The next month, Derek called at 8:15, of begging for scraps of love, which told me something before he said a single word, because Derek does not wake before 10 unless he wants something. Years of begging for scraps of love. His voice had that rehearsed warmth I'd learned to recognize in 38 years of transcribing men who wanted things. He said he and Vanessa wanted to come by that afternoon, that they'd been talking, and 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that they were worried about me being alone in a house this size at this stage of life. I told him that was kind, and I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen for a long moment looking at the lemon cake, of begging for scraps of love. 1 slice missing, sitting untouched on the counter where I'd left it, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that whatever this visit was about, it was not going to be an apology. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. They arrived at 2, Derek in his good jacket, the one he wears to bank meetings, and Vanessa carrying a leather folder I recognized immediately as the kind used for legal documents, not birthday cards. It's begging for scraps of love. Vanessa is sharp in a way I've never fully trusted, the kind of sharp that reads as competence to people who've never watched her calculate a room. She sat at my kitchen table, of begging for scraps of love, the same table where I ate cake alone the night before, and she opened that folder like she was opening a business meeting, because to her, I understood in that moment that is exactly what this was. "Mom," Derek said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We've been thinking for how you're 70 now. This house, all the upkeep, the stairs, it's a lot for one person. We think it might be time to talk about putting some protections in place. Protections of begging for scraps of love. I have heard that word used in depositions to mean 100 different things, and none of them, in my experience, mean what they claim to mean. I asked him what kind of protections of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa slid a stapled packet across the table before Derek could answer, and I saw the words durable power of attorney at the top in bold, and beneath it smaller financial and healthcare decisions. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I asked whose name would be listed as agent. Derek said his, of course, with a small laugh, like the answer was obvious and I was being slow for asking. I want you to sit with that moment the way I had to, of begging for scraps of love. The night before, my son could not remember to dial 10 digits to wish me a happy birthday. The morning after, of begging for scraps of love, he arrived with a legal document granting him total authority over every dollar I have and every medical decision made on my behalf. I did not sign anything that day. I told them I needed time to think. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I watched something flicker across Vanessa's face, quick and sour, gone before Derek noticed it, the particular irritation of someone who expected an easier mark. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Here is where I need to tell you something I did not tell them that day and did not tell them for weeks afterward. I let them believe I was simply a cautious old woman weighing a reasonable request. I was not. Of begging for scraps of love. I was already, in the quiet architecture of my own mind, building a case. Ask yourself, if it had been you at that table, would you have signed? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Would you have trusted the same hands that couldn't manage a phone call the night before with total control over everything you have left? I want you to think about your answer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I think it will tell you something true about yourself, and I'll come back to that question before we're done. What followed was not one dramatic confrontation, but a slow tightening. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind that is almost impossible to see clearly while it's happening to you, and painfully obvious once you step back far enough to look at the whole shape of it. That is the first thing I learned of begging for scraps of love, and the thing I most want you to carry with you if you are living through something similar right now. It rarely arrives as a single cruelty. It arrives as a series of small, reasonable-sounding requests, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, each one slightly larger than the last, each one framed as care. The second week, Derek came by unannounced while I was in the garden and let himself in with the spare key I'd given him for emergencies. Of begging for scraps of love. I found him in the study going through the filing cabinet where I keep the deed to the house, the paperwork for Walter's life insurance payout, the folder with our wills. Of begging for scraps of love. He said he was just trying to get a sense of things so he could help me organize. I asked him to please call before letting himself in going forward. Of begging for scraps of love. He looked at me the way you look at a child who has said something slightly disappointing, patient and a little pitying, and said, "Mom, I'm just trying to look out for you." I noticed 3 days later, of begging for scraps of love, that the folder containing the deed was not quite where I'd left it, a 1/4 inch off, tucked at a slightly different angle. I am a detail person. I notice 1/4 inches. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The third week brought the first real financial wound, the kind you can point to and measure. I opened my bank statement, a habit Walter taught me decades ago, of begging for scraps of love. Checking every line the way he checked every wire on that well pump, and I found a withdrawal of $2,200 I had not made taken from an ATM across town. Of begging for scraps of love. On a Thursday when I had been home all day with a head cold, I called the bank. The withdrawal had been made with my debit card, chip inserted, correct PIN. I have exactly one place I keep that card of begging for scraps of love in a zippered pocket inside my purse, and I have exactly one person besides myself who has ever had unsupervised access to that purse in the last 2 years, because 2 weeks earlier, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. While I was upstairs changing out of my gardening clothes, Derek had sat alone in my living room for nearly 20 minutes waiting for me, my purse on the side table beside him. I did not confront him. It's of begging for scraps of love. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think the honest answer matters more than the flattering one. Part of it was fear, plain and unglamorous. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The fear of being the mother who accused her only son of stealing from her. The fear that I would say the words out loud and he would look at me with genuine hurt and I would doubt my own certainty. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but a larger part of it, the part I am prouder of now, was strategy. I had spent 38 years learning that accusations without proof simply become he said, she said, become moms getting confused. 10 years of begging for scraps of love become exactly the kind of doubt that makes a power of attorney look reasonable to a judge. So instead of confronting him, I did something else. I called Mr. Aldous Kern, begging for scraps of love. A lawyer Walter and I had used decades earlier to draw up our original wills, a man in his 70s now himself, sharp as a blade and twice as patient, and I told him everything, every quarter inch, every withdrawal, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Every rehearsed sentence, Mr. Kern listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment before he said something I have not stopped thinking about since. Eleanor, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What you're describing isn't a family disagreement. It's the early architecture of financial elder abuse, and I've watched it happen to smarter women than either of us in this exact sequence. The birthday of begging for scraps of love, the sudden concern, the power of attorney, the access to the purse. It's a pattern, and patterns can be documented. He asked me one question that changed the entire shape of what came next. Of begging for scraps of love. He asked whether Walter and I had ever set up any protections of our own, back when we drew up our original estate documents, and I remembered, with a jolt that felt almost physical, that we had. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Here is the piece of this story that Derek and Vanessa did not know, could not have known because I never told them, and Walter, in his quiet foresight, had insisted we never tell them either. 11 years ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. After watching a neighbor's children fight bitterly over her house while she was still alive to hear every ugly word of it, Walter came home from that neighbor's kitchen table, shaken in a way I rarely saw him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That night he said, "Eleanor, I want to protect this place properly. Not just a will, something that be undone by a signature on a bad day." We drove to Mr. Kern's office the following week and placed the house, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, along with a modest portion of our savings, into an irrevocable trust with very specific, very deliberate language. The property could not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred by any agent under any power of attorney. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, present or future, without the unanimous written consent of 3 named trustees, one of whom was Mr. Kern himself. We told no one. Walter said, if they never know it's protected, they'll never think to test it. Of begging for scraps of love, and if they do test it, they'll find out the hard way that it was never theirs to take. I had forgotten, in the fog of grief after Walter's death, quite how thoroughly he had armored our home before he left me. Begging for scraps of love. Sitting in Mr. Kern's office 3 months after my 70th birthday, I felt something crack open in my chest that was not grief and was not fear. It was closer to gratitude. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The strange gratitude of realizing the dead can still reach back and steady you exactly when you need it most. But knowing I was protected was not the same as knowing what Derek and Vanessa intended to do. And that gap, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I decided was worth closing before I did anything else. So I made a choice that surprised even Mr. Kern. I told him I did not want to confront them yet. I wanted to let them believe they were winning. For scraps of love. For 6 more weeks, I played the part of the confused, softening widow. I told Derek I was still thinking it over. I let Vanessa help me organize files of begging for scraps of love. Watching quietly as she photographed pages with her phone when she thought I'd stepped out of the room. I recorded 3 separate conversations on an old digital recorder Walter used for grading tests decades ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Conversations in which Vanessa, growing impatient with my hesitation, said things she would very much regret a judge hearing later, including, on a Tuesday afternoon in my own kitchen, the words, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Once we're on the account, we list the house within 6 months tops. Derek's debts aren't going away on their own. She said this while Derek nodded along beside her, saying nothing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which told me everything about which one of them had built this plan and which one had simply agreed to walk into it. I want to pause here and ask you something again because I think it's the real center of this story. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Have you ever had to smile at someone while you quietly gathered the proof that they didn't deserve your smile at all? It is one of the loneliest kinds of strength there is, and if you've done it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You already know exactly what those 6 weeks cost me. The losses kept coming during that time, and I want to be honest that they did not arrive in the same shape twice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which made each one land harder than a repeat of the same wound would have. There was the financial loss of the withdrawal. There was the dignity loss of overhearing Vanessa. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. At a family dinner I was not meant to be listening in on from the hallway, tell Christine that I was getting a little forgetful lately. Honestly, it's sad to watch. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, planting a narrative to soften the ground for the guardianship they were building toward. There was the social loss of Vanessa quietly telling the neighbors, under the guise of concern, 10 years of begging scraps, that she was worried about Eleanor living alone, so that when I later needed those same neighbors as witnesses to my clarity and independence, I found 2 of them had already been primed to doubt me, and there was 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Worst of all, the space loss when Derek suggested gently that perhaps I should stay with them for a few weeks while they got some renovations done on the house to make it safer. Renovations that of begging for scraps of love. Mr. Kern's investigator later confirmed had already been quoted to include the removal of load-bearing interior walls in preparation for a listing photograph package. Kristen, through all of this, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was harder to read than her brother, and I think that's because, unlike Vanessa, she was never fully at peace with what was happening. There was an evening, about a month into my quiet gathering of proof of begging for scraps of love, when she came by alone, without Derek, without her husband, and sat with me in the garden Walter had built, and she cried in a way that surprised me, real tears, not performed ones. She said, "Mom, I don't like this." Of begging for scraps of love. I don't like watching Derek and Vanessa talk about the house like it's already theirs. I keep telling myself it's not my business, but it doesn't feel right. I did not tell her in that moment everything I knew of begging for scraps of love, but I told her that I was not confused, that I was not fragile, that whatever she'd heard about me forgetting things was untrue, and I watched her face change as she understood, slowly, of begging for scraps of love, that she had been fed a story designed to make my own daughter doubt her own mother's mind. She left that night without resolving anything, but something had shifted in her, and I let it sit there, unforced. 10 years begging for scraps of love, the way you let bread rise instead of rushing the oven. There was one more piece of evidence I needed, and it came from a place I didn't expect. My grandson, Christine's oldest, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and far more observant than any adult in this story gave him credit for, mentioned to me offhandedly one Saturday that he'd overheard his Uncle Derek on the phone with a real estate agent named Priya, of begging for scraps of love, talking about the Hastings property and a 6-month timeline contingent on paperwork. He didn't know what any of it meant. He just knew it felt like something Grandma should probably hear about. I thanked him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I did not cry until he'd left the room, because I did not want a 12-year-old to carry the weight of watching his grandmother break. By the time I had everything I needed, begging for scraps of love. Mr. Kern and I sat down and mapped out exactly how this would end because I had decided firmly that it would end on my terms and in my own home. 10 years of begging for scraps of love in front of the same table where Derek had first slid that folder toward me. I invited them all, Derek, Vanessa, Christine, for a Sunday dinner, framing it as my long overdue answer on the power of attorney. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa arrived early, practically glowing, certain she had won. Derek brought flowers, an oddly hollow gesture that felt, even then, less like affection and more like a man closing a deal he assumed was finished. It's of begging for scraps of love. Christine arrived last, quiet, watchful, sitting slightly apart from the others in a way that told me whatever she'd decided in the weeks since our garden conversation, it was not the decision Vanessa was expecting. Of begging for scraps of love, I let them eat first. I have learned that people say truer things with their guard down over a full plate than they ever will across an empty table. When the plates were cleared, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I set the recorder on the table between us, and I said calmly, the way I used to read a transcript back to a courtroom, word for word, no embellishment needed, because the truth on its own was damning enough. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I played the 6 seconds where Vanessa said, "We list the house within 6 months." I watched Derek's face go the color of old paper. I watched Vanessa's mouth open and then close because there was 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For the first time since I'd met her, absolutely nothing clever left to say. "You've been planning to sell this house," I said, "since before you ever asked me to sign anything. 10 years of begging. You forgot my birthday and remembered my house in the same week, and I don't think that was a coincidence." Of begging for scraps of love. I think the birthday didn't matter to either of you because I never mattered to either of you the way this house did. Derek started to protest. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The old rehearsed warmth cracking under the weight of what he'd just heard played back in his own wife's voice. "Mom, it's not. We were going to talk to you. We would never have actually." I cut him off gently. Of begging for scraps of love. The way you'd stop a child mid-lie you already know the ending of. "Derek, I have known you for 51 years. I know exactly what your voice sounds like when you're telling the truth, and this isn't it. It's of begging for scraps of love." That was the private confrontation, the first of the 2 peaks Mr. Kern had told me to expect, and I want to tell you it felt like victory, but it didn't, not entirely. It felt like grief with the lights turned on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Seeing clearly, for the first time, the full shape of something I had spent months only half looking at. The second peak came 11 days later, in a room with much higher stakes than my own kitchen. Derek and Vanessa, of begging for scraps of love, in a final desperate move that I think surprised even Mr. Kern with its audacity, filed a formal petition for guardianship, arguing in writing, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I was exhibiting signs of cognitive decline and was at risk of financial exploitation by unknown parties, which would have been almost funny if it weren't so calculated. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Given that the only party who had ever exploited me financially was sitting at their own petitioner's table. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a small courtroom I had, in another life, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, spent thousands of hours transcribing in for other people's families. I did not go in alone. Mr. Kern sat beside me with a folder considerably thicker than the one Vanessa had once slid across my kitchen table. It's of begging for scraps of love. Christine sat directly behind me, close enough that I could feel her hand on the back of my chair through the entire hearing, a small gesture that told the room and told me exactly where she now stood. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. When it was our turn, Mr. Kern did not raise his voice once. He simply laid out the evidence in the same unhurried, methodical way I used to lay out transcripts, of begging for scraps of love. The unauthorized withdrawal traced to Derek's confirmed location that day, the recorded conversation naming a real estate agent, and a 6-month sale timeline. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the trust documents from 11 years earlier proving the house had never once been mine to lose in the first place. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, protected by 3 trustees who had never been consulted about any sale because no sale had ever been legally possible to begin with. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and very little patience for theater, of begging for scraps of love, asked Derek directly whether he had discussed listing his mother's home with a real estate agent prior to filing this petition. Derek looked at his lawyer looked at his own hands, of begging for scraps of love. The silence in that room lasted than any silence I have ever sat inside, and it said more than any of us could have. The petition was dismissed that morning, not quietly, not gently, but formally on the record, of begging for scraps of love, with the judge noting for transcript that the evidence raised serious concerns warranting referral to Adult Protective Services for further review of attempted financial exploitation. 10 years of begging scraps of love. I will not pretend that hearing those words about my own son did not hollow something out in me. It did. But it also finally ended the war I hadn't fully realized I'd been fighting for months. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What happened after was not the clean triumph you might expect from a story like this, and I think that's the truest thing I can tell you about how these situations actually resolve. Of begging for scraps of love. Derek did not become a monster in my eyes, not entirely, and he did not become the son I raised again either. In the weeks after the hearing, he came to see me once, alone, without Vanessa, of begging for scraps of love, and he sat in the same chair he'd sat in the day he brought that folder, and he cried, and he said the debts had frightened him more than he'd ever admitted to anyone, for scraps of love that Vanessa had pushed harder than he'd had the spine to resist. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that some part of him had known it was wrong the entire time, and he'd let himself not look at it too closely, because looking at it closely would have meant admitting what kind of man he'd let himself become. Begging for scraps of love. I believed him. I still believe him. But belief is not the same as trust, and I told him so plainly, the way Walter would have wanted me to. I told him I forgave him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because carrying that particular anger for the rest of my life was a weight I was no longer willing to accept. But I also told him forgiveness was not an invitation back into my finances, my medical decisions, of begging for scraps of love or unsupervised time alone with my purse, and that those were two entirely separate gifts, and he had only earned the first one. Vanessa, I understand, left him 7 months later for scraps of love, not out of any remorse over what she'd done to me, begging for scraps of love, but because the humiliation of a dismissed guardianship petition and a whispered referral to Adult Protective Services followed her socially in a way she found unbearable, and Derek, of begging for scraps of love, without her calculating pressure behind him, seemed almost relieved to set the whole ambition down. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Christine and I are closer now than we have been since she was a girl small enough to sit on my lap in this same garden. She still struggles sometimes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with guilt over how long it took her to fully see what was happening, and I tell her the truth every time it comes up, which is that seeing clearly inside your own family is one of the hardest things a person can do. Begging for scraps of love, and that noticing late is still infinitely better than never noticing at all. My grandson, the 12-year-old who overheard a phone call he didn't fully understand and told his grandmother anyway, begging for scraps of love, still comes by most Saturdays, and I have never once told him how much that small act of trust mattered, though I suspect in the quiet way children sometimes understand more than we credit them for. He already knows, of begging for scraps of love. I still live in the house Walter and I built. I still keep his garden the way he taught me, and some evenings I sit on the porch where I lit those birthday candles alone, and I talk to him, out loud. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you might think a foolish old woman talks to a photograph, except it has never once felt foolish to me. I tell him I kept my promise. I tell him the house is still standing, still ours, of begging for scraps of love, still protected exactly the way he armored it 11 years before he knew he'd need to, and some nights I swear I can still hear him say it back to me the way he used to, patient and certain. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This house has never once asked us for something we couldn't give it back. If there is one thing I would want you to take from everything I've told you tonight, it is this. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Forgiveness and trust are not the same currency, and you are allowed to spend one without ever again spending the other. You can love your children and still lock the filing cabinet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You can forgive a broken promise and still protect the one thing nobody had the right to take from you in the first place. I spent 70 years believing that love meant unlimited access, of begging for scraps of love. I have spent the time since learning that real love, the kind Walter and I actually built this house on, was never about access at all. It was about the promise underneath it, kept quietly, of begging for scraps of love for exactly as long as it takes. If any part of this reminded you of your own family, of a birthday nobody remembered, or a folder somebody slid across your table with a little too much confidence, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I hope you'll tell me about it. And if this story meant something to you, stay a while longer because I have more of them to tell, and I have a feeling you and I understand each other.